at least a few times in elementary school, someone would tell us how to duck under our desk in case we were attacked. I I didn't know then, and I don't know now how that was supposed to protect us, but we were told that if we were attacked to couch under our desk. We were also told about fallout shelters and that we should get to the nearest fallout shelter. And I didn't think about this at the time, but now that I look back on it, we're talking about the 50s, Jim Crow, where we, people that look like me, were not even allowed to go in the front door of a movie theater. So who was going to let me in a fallout shelter? But we were told to go to a fallout shelter. And at that time, I was good with that. We would go to a fallout shelter if we were attacked. Now, who were we supposed to be attacked by? I would hear Soviet Union all the time. Soviet Union. The Soviet Union could attack us. That's what I was hearing. Now, on Saturdays at noon, every Saturday in my city, I lived in Greensboro, North Carolina. At Saturdays at noon, there would be this alarm, this siren that would alarm throughout the whole city. You could hear it throughout the whole city, and even some surrounding cities could hear this siren that would go off at noon on Saturdays. I was told that that was an alert that would go off, that on Saturdays at noon, what we're hearing is just the test. But if we were ever attacked, I suppose if the Soviet Union ever attacked us, that alarm would go off to alert everybody that we're being attacked. And if we heard that sound, if we were at school, we would crouch under our desk. Or if we were not at school, we would try to find the nearest fallout shelter. Now, even as a child, I just always thought, well, if I was the enemy and I wanted to attack you, why wouldn't I just attack you on Saturday at noon? Because that way everybody would just believe it was a test. I never understood why they just wouldn't take advantage of that 12 o'clock noon and everybody would be confused as to whether it was real or not. Then I remember on the TV, we had what was called test patterns. And the test pattern, I remember two things about it. I recall the test pattern when the TV went off. There was an hour, I think it was like midnight, that the TV, when we were young, the TV would go off and there would be no programs overnight. The TV would come back on again the next morning. So when they played the Star Spangled Banner, Star Spangled Banner was the last thing you would hear on the TV before they'd put up a test pattern. And that test pattern is what would stay up overnight until the TV's channels opened up again and they started sending out the programs again. But also I remember test patterns every now and then. There'd be a test pattern and again a little alarm would go off and a voice would say, this is just a test. But if we were really having an emergency, this is what you would hear. So we had those test patterns. Now, for me, all of these things combined did instill a sense of fear to the point where there were many nights where I could not go to sleep because I was concerned that we might be attacked, because it always seemed like we had an enemy out there that wanted to attack us and drop bombs on us. And we never knew, though, what moment that was. That's why we had all these test alarms so that we could be alerted if something happened. The Vietnam War, people forget, actually started in 1955. So I was 5 when the war actually started. But we didn't get involved in the war until around 1961. Between 1961 and 63 is when U.S. troops were starting to be sent to Vietnam. And I really was not even aware of the Vietnam War until I was a teenager, because it wasn't until I was like in my teens that I was able to understand what was happening. There were people in our community, in our neighborhood, people at my school who had siblings who were being drafted, who were being sent to Vietnam. And to me, that was just a thought I could not, I had a hard time, and to this day, I have a hard time wrapping my brain around the fact that you're being sent around halfway around the world when you never even left the Carolinas. Now you're being sent someplace, and your mission is to fight, kill someone, or be killed. Unfortunately, there were a lot of Americans, a lot from our community that were killed, came back maimed. There were people who were in trouble because they didn't want to go to fight, so they were caught lying on the forms, or they were in hiding, or they moved away, or they were trying to get away because they didn't want to go to the war. A lot of people that I know were really against the war because nobody really understood. Even me as a teenager in high school, I never really got a real good grasp of why we were going over there to fight. What I later came to understand is, and I'm just going to simplify it, is that there was the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese, the communists, wanted to take over the South Vietnamese, wanted to hold Vietnam to be under their communist rule. And the United States, and other countries too, but the United States decided, well, we can't let that happen, because I believe it was John F. Kennedy who used the term the domino effect. If they get that, if they can take the South Vietnam, then what's to stop them from just taking and taking and taking and taking? And so, wow. So we were not, it wasn't until like 63, I believe Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. And President Johnson then started sending more and more and more troops over. That's when just a lot of young American men were being sent over to Vietnam to fight. There were protests. And so when I went to college, because this war, the Vietnam War, lasted 20 years. I was 5 when it started, and I was 25 when it officially ended, although it was 73 when we pulled our troops out. There were people who said we shouldn't be fighting over there. What are we fighting for? We shouldn't be involved. And then I remember, of course, there were people who wrote songs, War, what is it good for? There was the Temptations had a song called War, what is it good for? The lyrics would go absolutely nothing. And then there was a singer, Edwin Starr, who also had a hit of that song. And then there were just lots. I mean, there were songs, protest songs. There was poetry, there was plays, there was Hair that was on Broadway that focused on this war and young men being drafted and how they felt about it. I just remember the Vietnam War just was this thing that just hung over us. And to this day, I feel like anybody that put on a uniform and went to fight, to sacrifice your life, even if you didn't die, but just the sacrifice that you made to go fight, that you shouldn't want for anything. And that's why it breaks my heart when I see vets that are having a hard time. I feel like if you went to do that, you should never want for anything. When you come back home, you should not want for anything. But I digress. To me, the saddest thing was when we pulled our troops back home in 73, and the war went on for a couple of more years, and then it was declared over. But the North Vietnamese, it is my understanding, they got what they wanted anyway. So it was 20 years of fighting, so many lost lives, so many destroyed families, and in the end, it didn't really make a difference. One of the things about war that really amazes me even today at 74 years old, I don't understand. When we were children and even in high school, if somebody got into a fight, if kids got into a fight, it was like, oh, fighting never solved anything. We must learn to talk it out, think it out, sort it out, reason, discuss, share ideas, you know. Now, I used to hear this when I was very young. If kids got into a tussle or a fight, it was like, oh, fighting never solved anything. And because the adults were telling me this, I assumed that by the time, I really did, I swear to God, I really believed that by the time I became an adult, we wouldn't have any more wars because we would have evolved to the point where we would just sit around a table, or our leaders would sit around a table and they would talk, reason, compromise, make it work without having to actually fight someone. So we're not at that point yet. So today is 2024. We'll have a lot of messy stuff that's going on. And I don't know, without sounding foolish or sounding like a child, I really do wish we would get to that point where we could just sit around a table, our leaders could sit around a table and just talk it out and be reasonable and reason and compromise and say, okay, you take this and I'm going to take that, or you have this and I have that. It seems like we should be able to do that. War.